Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the Frame and Sequence podcast. My name is Todd Rittendaro, and in this episode I sit down with photographer Robert Spangle. Robert is a Los Angeles-based photographer, but can be found traveling for 30 weeks out of the year, photographing for the likes of GQ, Vogue, the Rake, and many others, as well as pursuing personal projects around the world. In this episode, we talk about his experiences in the Marines with 2 deployments to Afghanistan, becoming an apprentice on Saville Row, and how he ultimately found photography. We also delve into why he shoots with a Leica MD system, what influenced his style and aesthetics, and his ongoing projects exploring hyper-masculine roles such as matadors, fighters, and racers in the search for truth and spirituality. It was an absolute pleasure for me to interview Robert, and there's so much good stuff in this episode, so I hope you enjoy. Hi, Robert. Thank you so much for sitting down for me. I've admired your work for a really long time, and there's a lot I would love to ask you, so I really appreciate you doing this.
Well, Todd, very happy to be here.
First, I'd love to get a little bit into your background, which is incredibly fascinating. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Malibu, California.
Oh, you did? Okay.
And I lived there until I was 18, basically.
Oh, wow. And then did you join the military? Obviously, you were in the Marines. And
yeah, I signed up when I was 17 and a half, and I went as soon as I graduated, which would have been 2007. So yeah, ways back at this point.
Did you always know that you wanted to do that when you were in beginning of high school, or was it a...
By the time I was in high school, I knew I was going to join the military, but it was not something I grew up wanting to do or thinking of doing. I decided shortly after September 11th, which I think I was about, I was 12 or 13 when that happened, and I think that was a very impressionable age. It's like this age where you kind of think you understand the whole world.
Sure.
Or are capable of thinking you understand the whole world, but don't. So that wound up shaping kind of my high school years. I was very set about joining the Marines.
Wow. And what was it about the Marines specifically?
I didn't really know anything about the military, so that wasn't my immediate choice. I hadn't really decided on a branch of service. I had a grandfather who was in the Navy, and I kind of knew I didn't want to do that. I thought that if I was going to join in a time of war, I wanted to be as hands-on and direct about it as possible. Wow. Otherwise, it just seemed like a kind of compromise on your time, and that seemed like the most you could do. So that left me, after a little bit of research, with the Army and the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps had higher standards and had a rougher reputation. So it's not that I thought that I was better than or necessarily Marine material. I just realized that the smarter of the two groups was the one who signed up for the hardest assignment with the highest standards, and I wanted to be surrounded by those guys.
Right.
If I was going to be in a war zone.
Makes sense.
So in a weird way, it was sort of survival instinct and logic.
Wow, incredible. And then you took it one step further, obviously, with special forces within the Marines, right?
Right. So I got, and that again was good luck. I've had a lot of good luck. I'd had quite a few years to train to be ready to join the Marines, and I signed up very young. I signed up as young as you could. My parents had to sign off on it. Wow. Because I'd had a lot of time to get ready. I did really well on the entrance tests, and this was also a time when I think like the war was at its height. So they said, "Hey, you've got a really high GT score, and you did really well on the physical fitness stuff. Why don't you try out for reconnaissance once you've gone through infantry school?" And I told them no, because I didn't really want to do anything special. I just wanted to do the infantry, and that was what the Marine Corps was about to me. But they were insistent, and they said, you can also swim. You've done a lot of stuff in the water. Like, we need guys with that background. So I said, after they told me that if I failed, I'd wind up being in the infantry anyway, I said, okay, why not? If I can be if I can be more utilized, then let's go that way. But I didn't know anything about reconnaissance, and this wasn't pre-internet, but there was not a lot of information out there.
Right.
So I wound up going to the basic reconnaissance course. Spent 2, maybe 3 months going through their kind of holding training program, which is just getting thrashed every single day.
God, I can imagine.
And like learning knots and like little useless things like that. Then I went through BRC, which was an additional 3, maybe 4 months, with a really, really high attrition rate. I survived that, made that through, and they sent me over to 2nd Recon Battalion, which is in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Camp Lejeune, I got even luckier without even really comprehending how lucky I'd gotten. Alphabetically, I was one of the last three guys on the call sheet. So right when we showed up at the unit, we got off the bus and they were telling everyone what company they were going to. And they told me and the three guys in front of me or maybe behind me that we were going to go over to Force Company, which put us in Force Reconnaissance, which was very much against the standards of the unit. Normally you have to have 2 combat deployments and about 6 years of experience in the Marine Corps and perfect recommendations and perfect physical testing and expert riflery and all these things to apply to get into this unit. But they had a lot of casualties. They lost quite a few guys to going to other special forces units, and they no longer had enough people in the unit for it to be active, for it to be listed as active. They were very, very short on personnel. So we showed up. We were basically told, you guys are placeholders. You're here for like the next couple of weeks, maybe like 2 months, until we can find correctly qualified personnel to fill out these jobs. But basically, sit down, shut the fuck up, and hopefully you can learn a thing or two.
Wow.
Before you get bounced elsewhere, which at the time was really disheartening. As it turned out, a couple guys got bounced out, and I was on we were on assignment in an island off of South America when President Obama sent us directly to Afghanistan on about 48 hours notice, 72 hours notice, I think it was, which is one of the special capabilities of that unit, is that they can go on a 6 or 7 month deployment anywhere in the world and be from notification to getting into the country that less than 3 days.
Wow.
So that happened, and then when I returned from that deployment, they were like, okay, we're going to hold on to you guys. So,
wow.
Yeah, that was a little bit of choice and a lot of luck. So.
Right. Wow, man, what an incredible journey through the military. Was photography on your radar at that point?
Absolutely not. I hated photography.
Oh, really?
There's a lot of amateur photographers in my family, which meant that every Christmas card we ever did was like a Anne Leibovitz production, and just like the bane of my existence. I think the only like negative memorable episode of my childhood is like I threw a rock at a photographer, which my parents had, I think, hired to do family portraits, and I just like hated being told to sit still and I hated being in front of a camera, so I hated photography actually growing up.
That is so funny.
I was given a really nice camera by my grandfather for a birthday, which I don't even think I took it out of the packaging, and I grew up drawing, so I really I looked down on photography. I thought it was really, really I thought it was a sort of like a pseudo art, and there was a lot of insecurity in it. I just didn't like it at all. And then in the military, we had a full Canon suite. It's about $100,000 worth of camera equipment.
Wow. Whatever
Canon's top of the line camera was, there was 2 of those. We had like a 400 millimeter lens, doublers, telephotos, like a lens suite of about 6 or 7 different lenses. Every kind of enlarger you could possibly have, and it was there, and you could use it whenever you wanted, and I never touched it.
It wasn't part of the job even with recon or anything?
It was because normally the point man at any team carries out a full camera suite, and normally a 200 meter lens with a doubler, or a 400 meter lens, even a 600 millimeter lens, which we call the Jesus lens. Because a huge amount of the job is gathering intelligence.
Sure.
I mean, that's the name of the game, is gathering intelligence behind enemy lines, and a huge amount of that is photographing people, identifying people, photographing compounds, photographing vehicles, and then digitally transmitting that back to your headquarters for analysis. So it was a huge part of the job, and that makes it's one of those things that makes it really unique within the Marine Corps. Wow. And every single person in the team is trained roughly how to use the camera, and I got as far away from it as I possibly could. I just didn't.
How funny.
I didn't want anything to do with it.
How funny. Gosh, I'm sure. I mean, there's 3 to 4 other hours worth of questions I could definitely ask you about Marine stuff. Most of which you probably can't even talk about. But
it's been 5 years. We're all right.
But I'm also fascinated. So, not to gloss over that. Is there anything you feel like you want to talk about within that?
I think, I mean, as it as it relates to photography or future things, I wound up looking back on those years quite often thinking, man, what a amazing opportunity for photography that I totally totally didn't seize and didn't see at the time, which was unfortunate. But one of the key things that came out of it that did wind up manifesting in photography was the idea of being an observer, and also the idea of just a keen interest in the world and having the ability to travel, and traveling as like wide and far as possible. That was something that in the military, like whether you liked it or not, you were used to it after a year. And after 4 years, you'd either be like insane and totally sick of it, or you'd come to love it.
Right. And did you feel like you got the travel bug from being in the Marines, or were you glad to be back?
I think I was not so interested in that before joining the Marines, and then afterwards I realized that I'd been totally fine traveling every 2 weeks, every 10 days is what it about averaged to. Wow. And sucking up the kind of suck factor of that open your horizons to so many different things if you were just willing to like live kind of in the rough and be willing to go anywhere.
Right. Yeah, man, that's really, I find that whole world so fascinating that I just don't really know a whole lot about. But then something that also fascinates me is that just doing a little bit of research on you, then you were an apprentice to a tailor on Saville Row.
Right.
After the Marines. So how did you make that leap from sort of this military lifestyle mindset to men's tailoring?
I mean, it was a complete 180, and that part of it was very much intentional. I realized in the military that you were very much in a fixed culture, right? And that culture revolved around the military and your duties and different stations and things like that. But I came to realize there was a lot more to life than that. Luckily, I had some good Marine friends who were like maybe a little bit more open-minded and wanted to see things, outside of just like strip clubs and gun stores and like cheap bars. But I realized, getting into the military, like there was a lot more to the world than just what I'd seen in the military, and that was worth exploring. And I guess thinking about getting into the military, I was starting to get interested in clothes a little bit, and like the books I would have been encountering was like Alan Flusser's books.
Oh yeah.
So I was sort of aware of tailoring before anything else, and I was like, oh, what a beautiful idea, this idealized, harmonized form, and it's really very far removed, almost as far removed from fashion as it is from being a Marine. It's like this timeless, fixed ideal, which I really liked. And I guess that kind of that stayed in the back of my mind, and I went to university, and I quickly realized I didn't want to design video games. That was my original idea, and I wound up sort of falling into studying fashion because I was like, okay, I have a budding interest in it. It involves drawing. I don't really know what else I'm going to do. It's 98% women. So I went into that for about a year. I studied that, and as I came to understand fashion, I realized that like I really wanted to do something more pure, and I didn't feel very secure in my place or belonging in fashion. It was just like something I'd sort of fallen into, and everyone I was surrounded by was really invested and really understood it, and I wasn't quite there yet. So I thought, okay, like I really want to have a foundation in this, and I really want to approach this in a really pure way. Walter van Beerdendonck, who is a famous designer in his own right, but also the head of the Royal Antwerp Academy of their fashion department, came and gave a speech at the school I was attending, and his line was basically that fashion was and is and should only be approached as a high art, as an artistic mode of expression, and everything else was secondary and not really to be considered. And that kind of blew my mind because I was going to a very commercial school, and I left school after that and decided that I was going to do tailoring because that seemed like the bedrock of men's fashion, and it seemed like the most like extreme foundation you could have. It was almost like an architect's approach, right? So I started looking at like how do I get to Saville Row, right? This is it's a much easier thing now, but back then it was like a lot of digging through the internet, and I found a apprenticeship program there at Mari Sedwell.
Wow.
I think I wrote them an email, and I said, hey, I'm living in the United States. I'd like to come do this, and talked to them on the phone, and they said they had a space. So I packed up what few things I had, and I moved to London.
Wow, incredible.
It was a bit of a leap because I'd never really done any tailoring before, and I was not very good at sewing. So I was like, oh, great. I'm going to go dive into my absolute weakness right now. I showed up there, and I absolutely loved it. It was the best decision I think I've ever made in my entire life.
Wow.
I was there for a year and a half, something like that. I spent 6.5 days a week working from about 9 a.m. until 7, 8, 9, 10 p.m., whatever it was, just learning how to be a tailor. So learning pattern making, cutting, actual making of the garments, fittings, finishing as well. I really, really enjoyed it. It was like the most pure part of my life. All I was doing was tailoring.
Wow.
You were learning every day. The standard was very, very clear. In some ways, it was a little bit like going back to the military. It was a very high standard. The standard was understood. Everyone who was there was passionate and hardworking. Whether they were talented or not was kind of what you were finding out in the first year and a half.
Right.
I really enjoyed it, and also I got to be surrounded by people who had the same passion that I did.
Mm-hmm.
In the military, I was surrounded by people who were exceptionally hardworking. We had the same values, we had the same goals. We didn't necessarily have the same passions. So being around a group of people who all had the same passion was absolutely electrifying.
Wow.
And that was also the period where I got heavily into photography. I'd had it started as a hobby a few months before I went to London, and then it really it became this thing that like very sneakily preoccupied my life while I was out there. And then about the time I was getting ready to leave London, I got my first job offer, and that kind of
sent you off on that track.
That became something that was more or less very different from tailoring.
That's incredible. Did you have any formal mentors or training in photography at that point, or were you shooting street style?
So I was told, it's a bit complicated. I had to take a photography course in college as like a 101 prerequisite type of thing, and it was that and some other class that I was totally not interested in. So I took photography because I thought, if I'm going into fashion, this is at least relevant, because there are fashion photographers, and I was aware of that, and I was like, okay, if I'm designing things, I'm going to have to work with a photographer at some point. So I took that photography class, and I didn't have any mentors. I didn't have any interest in it at all, really. I was aware of Scott Schulman's work, which I loved.
Yeah.
That was like probably one of the first blogs I ever followed, and I thought that was his perspective on fashion was also my interest in fashion. I wasn't so interested in like the runways yet, or even high fashion, but I love to see it on the street. I love to see the way actual people put it together, because I think what had prevented me from really engaging with fashion at any other point in my life was the fact that I think if you're like an average American dude from Malibu, California, you open up a fashion magazine, like you're going to be put off. There's a lot of like really homoerotic imagery, which like as a young guy is like hard, like it's really hard to deal with. Sure. Right? It's like hard to get your it's hard to get past, right? Especially if you're in the Marine Corps. That's definitely frowned upon then, and probably still now. And Scott Schulman's approach was much more like, this is what real dudes are wearing. This is what real people are wearing, and isn't this great? And like, not all these guys are models, and not all these guys are millionaires, and like, it really helped me understand fashion in human terms. So I was aware of that. Didn't want to be a photographer. The first guy I photographed, though, fundamentally changed the way I valued photography. The shortest version possible is I was just like taking photos for my first assignment on the street, and this guy, super jovial, radiantly happy, came up to me and insisted that I take his portrait. And this was in downtown LA. So this guy could have been really happy-go-lucky, or he could have been totally insane, because downtown LA has a lot of totally insane people. I kind of looked at him, and he had like a faded Lakers jersey and like ripped up skinny black jeans and some Nikes, which was the style then. And it kind of occurred to me, like, this guy could be like a rapper, or he could be homeless. Like, I don't know. eventually he convinced me to take his photo, because I was like, basically like, if I take the photo, then he's going to be happy and he's going to leave. So I took a photo of him and he was super happy, and he went his way and I went home. And the following day, I was on that same street, and I went to the same cafe that I always went to, and they had a memorial for this guy who I recognized from his first name, and his picture was on it, and I'd taken a picture of him yesterday. I was totally blown away. I talked to the people at the cafe, and he'd killed himself. Like,
oh my God.
Within, a few hours, maybe an hour after I'd taken his picture. He was a producer of some kind, successful, super manic depressive. And I went back and I looked at this picture I'd taken, and I was like, this is just a picture of a guy who is stylish and looks really, really happy. And it's also, at this time, this is his obituary. This is also a really poignant picture of the extremes of mental illness. This guy was alive and radiantly happy to the point where he was stopping strangers in the street, and then that same evening he decides to end his life. So it really disturbed me. I put my camera away, and I kind of felt cursed. I was like, I just left this profession where a lot of people were dying all the time, and I sort of wanted to get as far away from that as possible. That's part of the reason I went into fashion, was like, to live in this fanciful, beautiful world, and now people are dying again. What the hell?
Wow, man, that's intense. Jeez.
But after like a very, very few days, I had a camera again, and I really started then going out and just taking pictures of people who interested me. Really bad amateurish pictures. But by the time I got to London, the head cutter of the shop that I worked at, who was a bit of a mentor and wound up kind of mentoring me in photography, even though he didn't know it, Andrew Ramroop, he told me, because he saw me carrying his camera, he's like, look, if you see someone wearing a suit you like, go take a picture of them. Study that picture, figure out how that suit fit them, figure out how it worked, why it worked. Look at the interaction between the cloth and the body and figure out why that worked, and then come back and try to do it here.
I like that.
So kind of with his encouragement and blessing, I was showing up to work very early, taking a lot of photos, taking photos at lunch, taking photos after work. And a lot of it was guys, like people I worked with, other people in the row. It's a small society, and it's very closed. But that was kind of my way of studying fashion. So I did that the entire time I was there. That became a blog, and became, this was like Tumblr. People started, kind of following it, interacting with it, and there was positive feedback there, so I kept doing it. And then eventually that culminated in a job offer.
Wow, incredible. What was the first job offer?
So the first job offer I had was from British GQ, which is a
pretty good one.
Which is totally out of the blue. I opened my laptop one day, and Nick Carvel, who's now a really close friend of mine, had written me an email and said, hey, we have this street style section. We really like what you're doing. Would you consider doing it for us? I totally bit my tongue, because I was like, I'm a complete amateur. I'm not even using a real camera. I've never once considered myself a photographer. And I also realized that if I was working for them, then that meant I was going to be traveling quite a lot, and I couldn't do tailoring anymore. So that was a tough choice, because I really liked tailoring and I really enjoyed it, and I had just sort of gotten the hang of it. Then there was this photography offer, and I probably struggled with that for like a month.
Wow, I bet.
Or maybe I've been struggling a bit leading up to this. I'm not really sure now, but it was one of these moments where I had to be like, I learned to be very honest with myself, and I told myself for a long time, like, I want to be a tailor and I want to be a designer. But I had to recognize what I was telling myself I wanted to do and what I actually enjoyed doing. And I really enjoyed photography, and I was waking up early to do it. And my girlfriend at the time, I remember, like, kind of called me. We were in separate countries, and was like, you're not very good at design, but you're really good at photography. Maybe you should do that. And I kind of recognized, oh, look, you know what? What else in my life have I ever been willing to wake up super early on a cold morning and go outside and been excited to go and do? And photography was kind of the thing. So I jumped very abruptly into photography, reasoning that if it didn't work out, I could be a tailor when I was 40.
Right.
I probably couldn't be a globe-trotting photographer, because I would just be more old and tired than I already was at that point.
Oh man, that's so fascinating. Did he ever, what was the GQ editor's name?
Nick Carvel.
Did Nick ever say what it was about your images that he was responding to?
we talked about it later. Once I knew him to the point where I could confess, like, I wasn't a photographer then and I had no idea what I was doing, but thanks for the job. And I think he had seen my images a couple other places, and I think he liked that I was looking at things from a tailor's perspective, and that's what he got from it. I wasn't just photographing guys in suits.
Right.
It was guys in Soho, guys in the East End. But I think tailoring gave me a really, really good eye for proportion in silhouette, and then also color as well.
Right.
Maybe a bit conservative, but it's a really good bedrock to evaluate things from. I think if you're just interested in fashion and you're like 22 or 23 and taking photos on the street, like, you're going to photograph a lot of stuff that's pretty naff just because it's interesting or you don't understand it. Whereas if you have tailoring as a background, even if you're photographing something that isn't tailoring, you're looking for proportion and silhouette and color and contrast. And that is, like I said, a better or more classical way to approach it, more universal, maybe a little bit more mature.
Yeah, I love that.
I wasn't aware of any of that at the time. I was just doing.
Yeah, there's a deeper intent that you're looking for that probably most, younger street style photographers or amateur photographers are not really aware of. They're just responding to what's pretty.
Right, which I wasn't aware of either. I was just I was literally just reacting to things with the camera, and that was it. It just happened to be that I had a background that informed me in an advantageous way. And
that is super fascinating. That's super cool. And then so you ended up shooting for that. Was that sort of a staff position? Or
wasn't a staff position, or I think initially when you started working together, that was like a staff position, and that was kind of discussed. I also didn't know what a contract was. I didn't know freelance versus anything at the time. Once I kind of figured those things out, I realized that staff was not the best way to go for me.
Yeah.
I think I was told a couple of times that, like, my desk was being used for the surplus sponsored snacks. Fitting anyway. But yeah, I mean, with that, I slowly kind of got my hang for the industry, and I had to figure out what it meant to be to be a professional photographer. And that was probably the point in my life where I luckily encountered, like, a lot of mentors and people who kind of, like, gave me the hip pocket class on, like, how to be a professional and how to get people to pay you, and
it's always helpful.
What kind of camera I should be using, what kind of equipment I should use, and what my editing process should be, which I was really fortunate. Really fortunate.
Yeah. Were some of those other street style photographers or?
Adam Katz-Sindig was foremost in those. I ran into him the first fashion week I did, and I didn't. It was probably a while before I talked to him, but I was aware of who he was. He was encouraging from the get go, and he had the kind of professionalism that I could recognize from a military perspective. So I just paid very close attention to him for probably the first year I knew him, and was just like, what's he doing? That's the thing to be doing. That's what I should do. Melody Zhang, who's a photographer from New York, was also, like, very, very helpful in kind of like the do's and don'ts of the industry. And then David Nyazi, who's a London native photographer, helped me out quite a bit, like, in terms of us hanging out, shooting every day. This is the camera you want. This is like the real fundamentals.
Right.
So there was a long string of those.
Oh man, how fortuitous!
I got really, really lucky.
Oh.
I mean, I got really, really lucky.
Incredible. So, were you still based out of London at that point?
I was, but I very quickly exited London because I was not there with a visa that would allow me to work.
Yes.
So if I was going to be working for British GQ, I needed to return home, and this was a time where the pound was about 1.8 to the dollar, and I was burning through my savings like I couldn't believe. So I finished my apprenticeship as quickly as I possibly could.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons that I was in there 6.5 days a week.
Were they supportive of your move to photography as well?
Yeah. I had to go and talk to my head cutter about it, which is a hard thing to do. But he said, like, you're finishing up your training here, like, finish it up. It's a trade. It's always going to be there for you. And, like, honestly, super supportive. He was like, you have this opportunity for a magazine, like, go do that.
Incredible.
Andrew Rambroop was actually the guy who kind of first put these sort of menswear magazines in front of me. Like, I remember him or maybe the second week of my apprenticeship, everyone was sitting on their like 30-minute lunch hour, eating like homemade sandwiches and whatever, and on their phones probably, definitely. So really like a really like volatile guy is a really volatile guy, and he came in with a stack of magazines from the Rake, and just like threw them like discuses at every single person with like enough force to like knock your lunch out of your hand. And he said something like don't just fucking sit there, educate yourself. And he explained, you know, like this is the world you work in, and you need to be aware of it. You need to understand what is going on, not just on the street, but globally. So I remember opening up an issue of the Rake and being like, it was a revelation. It was like this magazine that I had always wanted, that really resonated with me, that was everything I wanted to see in fashion, but it didn't yet exist. You know, it was like old guys and like real gruff looking dudes wearing like classic clothes,
right?
You know, living like real life. It was not what I'd been accustomed to with fashion imagery, which is like greased up 18-year-old boys in like the Adriatic. And I was like, it was, you know, in the imagery kind of aligning with what I'd been looking for. That got some wheels turning, and I was kind of thinking, oh, like, you know, I take photos, and like my photos are more like this. Maybe I can do something like that.
Yeah. At that point, do you feel like you were developing your own personal aesthetic? I feel like when I see one of your photographs, I know it's yours before I see the name on Instagram or, you know, wherever. Was that a conscious choice, or did that just grow out of shooting?
I think at the time I wasn't developed enough or aware enough to make any kind of choices aesthetically as a photographer, mostly because I didn't think of myself as a photographer. I was just taking photos of what I like, but by virtue of taking photos that you respond to personally, and then selecting and editing those photos and putting them forth, you are kind of creating your version of the world. So I think there's a part of that process that is natural. And then later on, as I learned more about photography, I wound up getting back into film and studio photography. That's the point. And also when you're kind of studying, you start to study photographers you liked and have enough work to look back on. That's when I started deciding how I take photos and what I actually want an image to look like and what my values are graphically as a photographer. But that didn't occur until much later.
Yeah.
The first 2 years of taking photos was like just purely emotionally, like, I like this guy, I like what he's wearing, or I don't understand why this guy's wearing this, taking a photo and then wrestling around with it a little bit and like publishing it.
So now when you go out shooting, what is your thought process?
I think the thought process remains the same. I'm better informed and I take less photos, I hope. I definitely take less photos. I hope I'm better informed. But in terms of street style, or just like if it's reportage or journalistic work, you're just going out into the world and reacting to it,
responding to it. Yeah.
I think with time I've learned to try to push myself to be more reactive and put less thought into it. And then just the moment I have an instinctive reaction to something, then to take a photo.
Right.
There's been a conscious effort to keep a kind of like raw element in my own work.
Yeah.
That I think that's what you operate on when you start, and then when you get kind of used to things and you're up and running professionally, it's easy just to kind of go on autopilot and start to question things and start to think about things that take you farther away from your emotional reaction to the world around you or a subject in front of you.
Right.
So there's been the last 2-3 years definitely like a forceful effort to try to be more reactive and like put less thought into it initially, and be less judgmental and just be very, very reactive to whatever my eye kind of resonates with.
Yeah.
In terms of aesthetics, a lot of that is like how you're choosing to take a photo, not necessarily the image you're choosing to take. I think a lot of that is like how you're manipulating the camera, a little bit of how you're editing it, what kind of equipment you're using with,
right,
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think people would say that as a photographer is working like let's say in a documentative form or a reportage way, or I'm not going to stretch that into journalism, but photojournalism, but is working, let's say, in real life, you have less of these choices. I don't think it's necessarily true. In my case, like, I am choosing where to go in the world, and there's some kind of vein in interest that I'm chasing, so that represents a whole series of choices. And then choosing to be very, very thought out about what you photograph, or more close to your own emotion, your own eye. Those are also choices.
Yeah.
It's all choices.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I know one of the things that I love about your work is that it does maintain that raw element while still feeling incredibly refined. I'm thinking specifically of some of the bullfighting stuff, or obviously the street style work. I think just has a vibrancy to it, which is really nice. I feel like some street style stuff.
Thank you.
Some street style stuff can get, here's a picture of this person wearing this thing, but yours has a definitive point of view.
Right. Well, the street style has become like a de facto part of the industry, and once that's created, once this need is quantified with every single publication out there, then that becomes a case of it almost becomes an economy on itself. You know what I mean? There's supply and demand. I'm not going to say it's a choice, but I've always had a very, very narrow vein of what I'm interested in street style.
Mm.
I tried, photographing women's wear and doing like really like avant-garde fashion stuff, and like that just didn't hold my interest.
Yeah.
And therefore I don't think I was particularly good at it. And there are people who pick up that vein and do fantastic work with it, and I like to think that my way of evaluating things is still just like the silhouette and the cut and the color and the texture and context of it, and that's it. But that's still basically seeing fashion through a straw. Fashion is also maybe too big of a thing nowadays.
Yeah.
But I've always had that really narrow vein to things, so I think that resonates with certain people. It also makes it easier to pick up that thread from street style or fashion and carry it over to something like martial arts or bullfighting or racing or tribal Nagaland.
Right. Completely.
Because it's a broader spectrum. It's a set of lessons that you're kind of looking at.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it. Have you ever verbalized those, or is it more just what that is that you're looking for?
I think as a photographer, you're always trying to verbalize things, but you're just using images.
Yeah.
I hope. I think, at least working in my way, or I think your sort of duty as a photographer, you should spend a lot of time observing, but the process doesn't end there. You need to observe, and from those observations, you need to make deductions. You need to come to your own conclusions. You need to create your own theses, and then you need to test those theses. And if they're true or false, like, the result of that also needs to become images.
Right.
I don't see that process being any different if you're working with images or if you're working with words. It just happens to be where your natural strength lies. If I think I would be doing exactly the same thing if I had never gotten into photography, but I would be doing it in some other medium. Maybe not writing because I'm horrifically dyslexic, but words in the last couple years, probably 2 years, have become a part of my work because I realized that it's an error to allow other people to contextualize your work with words. Mm-hmm. And words are also a necessity. We're inundated with images these days, and unlike the world of maybe 15 or 20 years ago, you're not opening up a magazine or a newspaper and hearing about everything from fashion to sports to war to conflict to the local economy from the LA Times or some other publication in which they have a concise worldview. Now you're opening up your phone and you're getting, Beyonce's Instagram and a famine somewhere and the latest trend and whatever Elon Musk is up to.
Right.
All in one continuous scroll, and there's no context to any of it. So context becomes in that more important than ever. And as a photographer, I realized that after sending out a couple of products I really cared about and kind of having them either, a lot of them I felt like were just butchered by neglect. Someone else wrote the words, and the words did the piece no justice.
Right. That's tough.
Well, it's tough, and I understand. I mean, you're a writer, you're putting words to something that you weren't there for, and you have so many words you have to put down, you're on a deadline. So from that, I started writing from my own pieces.
Yeah.
Almost out of necessity, just to preserve the integrity of my own work.
Right.
Which is, writing is really hard for me. I'm not good at it, and it's very challenging. It takes me an absurd amount of time to write anything. I've got a piece coming out in a week, and it's 4 or 5 pages. It's taken me a year. I've worked on it literally every free second I had. I wrote 23, 25 versions of it.
Wow.
Some of them were 20 pages long. It's really, really hard. It's really hard for me, but I think doing the hard thing is very important. And I think the more involved you get with your own work, the more the integrity of it becomes important, and the more you have to have ownership of every part of it.
Yeah.
So words come into play with that. I still think that I'll always hope that my strength is images, because images communicate instantly. But you can't. I don't think it's possible to work in the way I've worked and not come to, from your own observations, come to your own conclusions, and then need to put those conclusions forward.
Right.
If you don't do that, you probably become very bored or very insane.
Definitely, that's a very good way to put it. Speaking of Instagram, how do you feel about the platform? Do you feel like you enjoy interacting with it, or is it a necessary evil at this point?
Well, it's become a part of the background, right? Like it's de rigueur. It's every day. It's part of everyone's life. It's been normalized, right? It's like it's a very normal thing, and I think that automatically means that something else is coming. As soon as something becomes like standard or everyday, then like something else is coming along to disrupt that. I still think, like a lot of people bitch and moan about it, I would still make the argument that a lot of good comes out of it. It's a fantastic way to communicate. It was originally a very, very democratic tool, and probably still is. And I think that in the times we live in, it's a necessity. I don't think it was born out of some great grand idea from a genius. It was something that a lot of people all over the world needed and necessitated, and therefore eventually someone was going to make it. The times we live in are amazing times, but we're also burdened with things that human beings have never had to face before.
Right.
We're having a worldwide existential identity crisis, which is super interesting, watching everyone lose their shit. But I think mostly it's a good thing. I think by and large, and Instagram is very, very much a part of this. We're at a time where not over the entire world, but most of the world that we're probably talking about, race doesn't really matter anymore. Where you're from doesn't really dictate who you are anymore. Religion certainly has almost nothing to do with who you are, or who you hang out with, or what your job is. The country you're from is, by and large, not so much to do with your own identity.
Yeah.
And with all those new freedoms we have, all of which I think are great, and also just the fact that we're traveling a lot and changing jobs a lot and changing cities quite a lot, with all the freedoms that gives us from these things that we used to be born into and we're totally fixed, we have a total identity crisis. Or, now being born into the world and going well into adulthood, having no idea who we are. And I think defining who we are has become a huge burden, right? And defining yourself as something that hasn't existed before is a challenge in and of itself. And then after your own identity is what is your group? What's your tribe? Who are the people who give your identity context? Who are the people that give your identity meaning? What do you do? Where do you share values, right? So modern tribalism is definitely a thing. And Instagram is a fantastic tool for that. It's an ability for people with like interests and often therefore like values to be able to find each other and have discourse. And that's amazing.
It is, for sure.
Almost everything else about Instagram is totally negative. But that facet of it validates everything else for me.
It is really fascinating to be able to find your tribe, for lack of a better word.
Case in point, we're here today.
Here
right?
we are.
That probably wouldn't have happened 20 years ago.
It's absolutely true. I mean, my entire podcast is basically based on, people who inspired me that I've found through various, most often than not Instagram, but other social media, like artists, photographers, filmmakers,
Right.
And so in that vein, I think that's a really interesting perspective that a lot of people don't think about.
Yeah, and I think the other half of it comes down to just discipline, which all human beings are capable of. You know what I mean? Don't spend 8 hours a day on Instagram.
Right.
I spend 10 minutes in the morning on Instagram, 10 minutes right before I go to sleep, and that's it. And that's enough
policy.
to check into people, talk to people, post something, whatever.
Yeah.
That's it.
I am not that disciplined. I'm ashamed to admit.
I think like that, you know, every generation has to develop a new discipline in some way, right? Because there's new technology, there's a loss of social norms, and like you have to learn how to interact with these things. You know what I mean? Every time a new drug is invented, like everyone goes crazy on it. A couple people die. There's some regulation, then people decide to chill out. Right? It's the same thing with new technology. And I see a lot of people that spend way too much time on Instagram, base way too many decisions on Instagram, and like their whole lives are kind of shaped with it, which is like totally wrong.
Yeah.
It's a great tool to connect with people. It's a great way to put your work out. How many hours of the day does that take?
Right.
Half an hour? Like, you gotta be disciplined. You know what I mean? We're social creatures. We're hardwired for social interactions. So you have to evaluate that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think if you evaluate it, it's fine. You know.
Yeah. So switching gears just a little bit. I don't normally love to like delve into gear and that kind of stuff, but I really.
Oh, it's too bad I do.
No, I know you do. Like, I definitely can, but I always think it's somewhat insulting for somebody to be like, oh, what'd you shoot that with? Like, as if that makes the picture. But I really do kind of want to get into your philosophy of shooting. I think is so unique and really intriguing, and I think people would really get a lot out of hearing you talk about it. And so, if you don't mind, I'd love to get into your choice of gear and how you think about it and why you choose the things that you do.
Well, and I'd preface that by saying that I agree with you entirely, and like I get the question all the time, like, oh, what lens did you use, what camera do you use, you know? And as a person that once asked those questions, like, I'm aware it's a very amateurish question, but also as a person that like loves gear, it's fun to geek out over.
For sure.
I think it's like the wrong philosophy to go into photography, especially just thinking about gear. I think photography is like a very insecure medium that teeters on the edge of art, and generally the people obsessed with gear are like not on the art side of it.
That is very true.
But I do think that if you look at equipment, rather than appraising it from specifications and capabilities and cutting edge and not cutting edge and newest and best and brightest, rather than looking at equipment from that perspective, which I did for a long time, you instead look at it from the perspective of your process.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your process as a photographer or an artist or whatever the case is, and how does your equipment interface with that, or how does your approach to equipment interface with that? That becomes a more valid and more interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
As for what I use, I've got like a Nikon suite that I shoot quite a lot of stuff on. That's very fast Nikon D5s with crazy telephoto lenses, and I still probably use the 85 the most out of that. I'm probably more proud of like the custom-made Romoa I made for it that has all my camera stuff than I am the camera itself. But what I'm now using a majority of the time for my own work and then assignments, probably now using it like 85 to 90% of the time, is the Leica MD system. The first time I saw Leica was like 5, maybe 6 years ago, in the hands of a photographer that I really looked up to at the time, Luke Carby, whose photography I loved, and he was one of the very few guys, like, technically, I looked at him and I looked at Sam Haskins and I was like, how do they do it? How do they do it?
Right.
I reshot Luke Carby's stuff once trying to get the same effect, and I was like, I don't understand. I was there. I had 2 days. I couldn't get it. He got it. I couldn't get it. What's going on? You know? And I ran into him at a party, and I don't actually think I've talked to him since then. And he was using a Leica, and he's like, I was like, what is that? He's like, it's a Leica. And I could just tell it was very expensive, and I was very broke, so I'm like, I don't want to touch it. Because if I touch it, I'll get the credit card, and I'll do regrettable things. I was aware of what a Leica was then. And then later on, I got into film, because I wanted to kind of like learn photography properly. I had a little bit of money then, so I wound up buying a Leica M6. And I came to realize that it was like a very, very pure system. It was very hands-on. Every finger falls on some kind of mechanical control, right? It's very limited. It's not appropriate for everything, but I love that it was so hands-on. It was so pure. The images were really, really pure. There's a definite quality to the images that come out of like a glass and like a camera. Like that's unquestionable. But more than that, because it's so hands-on and because it's so, you're not shooting 12 frames per second raw, and you're not doing, a 78 point autofocus all over the place on like 1.4. It really demands that you focus totally on whatever your subject is.
Yeah.
And not just focus on it. It gives you a sort of desperation. Like, the milliseconds count so much that you can't sit there and think, is this what I photographed? Is this not what I photographed? Is this good? Is this bad? Is this in good taste? Whatever. Like, you just have to fucking shoot it.
Right.
You have to, like, literally the second you feel an emotional reaction to something, you just have to, like, go. Which is a much more raw way of working, and whether that's a better way of working, I'll leave to other people to tell. But for me, that's closer to my own eye as a photographer. So that is the way I should be working, because the more reserved and distant I get from my work, the more my work, I feel, just looks very, very commercial, and like a lot of other people's work. I was shooting 2 Leica M6s for a long time, hundreds and hundreds of rolls of film. I was doing like 300 or 400 rolls every, 4 or 5 months.
Wow.
And I was learning a lot, but it wasn't really, I couldn't really work that way professionally. It was just, I can't turn around images in a single day.
Yeah. And
it wasn't a really commercial feeling photo, and I was lugging around like massive things of film, and I was getting into trouble with Russian security at Moscow Russians. International, and like it was I loved it, but it was really, really problematic. It was really problematic, and I was losing a lot of product, and I was spending way too much time scanning and cleaning up and things like that. And then a little bit over 2 years ago, Leica put out this weird camera called an MD, which was basically their digital M model without a screen. No HDI, no bracketing, no autofocus, obviously. So it looked like an M6. It felt like an old M6, except that you can shoot like 3,000 photos on an internal memory card, and you've got batteries.
Right.
So I took a gamble, and I wound up buying 2 of those and going out to the Mosul offensive in Iraq when ISIS was getting pushed out of Mosul, and I photographed everything.
Wow.
Those weeks, just on those 2 cameras, and it was a huge leap for me. I was really unsure whether that was going to pay off, but it wound up being like totally addictive. I really did not want to use anything after that. Everything else just felt cheap. But what I found was, like, you had 2 cameras, 2 lenses, no digital handicap, and you really just had to be completely present and hyper focused in the moment. And I love that. As a person with an attention span like a goldfish, like, I love that it demanded that of me.
Yeah.
And that I had to deliver on that. So that's where it started to shape my own process. I had to be completely and utterly present in the moment. I had to be completely reactive, and I didn't even have enough time to be cynical or prejudiced in any way. You just had to be there, and if you wanted to get a photo, you just had to be almost unconscious in it.
Right.
Which I really, really enjoyed. And then I also enjoyed the fact, like, you can't review the images.
Yeah.
It brought a lot of the imagery, or brought a lot of mystery back into the imagery, right? Like, I was, Fashion Week shooting 3,000-4,000 photos a day. Like, at the end of the day, you're just like 2 a.m. scrolling through shit, and you just don't care. Whereas these, like, I would shoot for months and not look at the images.
Wow.
And you're just shooting, and you would remember the images. You're like, oh God, I hope that comes out. That was really beautiful. I hope that comes out. And I would have a rule. I would go out and start taking photos every single day, and then I wouldn't look at the images until I finished the trip. So in that way, it was a lot like film. Like, it was a blind process, and because I wasn't aware of the images I was taking, there was no self-censorship. So I think with modern digital photography, you go out and take photos, and you're like, oh, why did I photograph that? Like, you can see too much of yourself, and you can see things you don't like in it, and you self-correct, right?
Right.
You like chip it, and then you self-correct. And whereas like Leica, it's like, no, you were taking pictures of that because you're lonely and sad, and like that's it, right? But those images are more true to who I am, or how I was feeling at the time, or what I actually experienced in that environment. So in that way, I started looking at it. I was like, okay, like, this is something that suits my process better. This is a conscious decision in how I'm interfacing with the equipment I'm using, how I'm interacting with the world around me. So that was definitely a choice, and that camera is not for everyone. It's not for most people. The only thing I would advise is, like, think about what your process is as an artist before you think about what your equipment is as a photographer.
Yeah, I love that idea.
That's it.
And I love your approach. I think it's really a great way to shoot. I learned on film, and when I go to digital, I am the worst chimper, and I will, like, self-flagellate after every shot.
Yeah.
Instead of just focusing on the on the shot.
Yeah, it's very much it's human instinct to do that, right? Like we love our reflection in our mirror. We love images. We love screens. So if it's not there, then it's not an option. There are downsides to it, and I say like that is not a camera for everyone. And to a lot of people who are fantastic photographers or have the capability to be, that's a $7,000 or $8,000 mistake. But if you understand what your process is or what you want it to be, it's a really interesting thing to look at. And you can also just put duct tape on the back of your Nikon and maybe it comes out the same way. I don't know.
Right.
But there are shortcomings with it, and it's like on the new one, which I now have, you can use Wi-Fi and you can review images if you need to, and you can live view images. So like that's nice. If you now I can shoot way more on that, because if I have a situation where I have a client over my shoulder and they're like, oh, is the focusing? It's like, well, yeah, here, look, just like you hook up your iPhone to it and leave me alone and I'll do my thing. So that's really nice. But I remember the first MD series, you couldn't do that. There was no way to review the camera except taking the memory card out and like shoving it in your MacBook and reviewing everything. We were at a Iraqi Special Operations Forces Forward operating base on one of the suburbs of Mosul with my friend and Shepard TMNF, who took me out to Iraq, or I was out there with him, I should say. And there was like Iraqi Special Forces guys, American Special Forces guys, French Special Forces guys, and Australian Special Forces guys, all kind of milling around. And I was, as I'd been in their shoes, I was really aware of security. And as I don't normally ask people's permission to take photos, but in this case I went up to every person. I was like, I am so and so, I'd like to take a photo of you. It's going to show this, and getting their consent, because I don't want to piss off these guys. And I respect what they do, and I understand that like an image can really put them in danger or really put their career in danger, and I don't want to do that. So I went up to every single person. I went to the Americans, and I'm like, hey, I'm so and so, I'd like to take a photo. And they're like, okay, like don't have this and don't have that. I'm like, fine, cool, whatever, here's a cigarette. As I was doing this and getting yeses and nos from people, I'm taking some photos, and this like totally irate Iraqi Special Forces dude comes running up to me with his M4, and he's screaming. He's like, you were taking photos of me. You were taking photos of me. This is sensitive. He's like, give me your camera. And I was like, he's like, delete it, And I was like, I showed him my camera. I'm like, it's like, there's no screen. What do I do? And I definitely not taking a photo of this guy. This guy was like not even anywhere near where I was photographing, but I had no way of telling him. And so he's like, I'm gonna take your camera. And he was threatening to like destroy my camera. And at this point, he had his rifle leveled at me, and I was really, really nervous. But I also didn't want to give him my camera because it's my camera.
Right.
So we ended up just having to argue like back and forth for a while. And I was like, there's no pictures. There's no pictures. And like a couple other people kind of chimed in and were like, he didn't photograph you, so it's okay. But there are, at least in the early MD system, there were like serious shortcomings in certain situations.
Right.
Just like people have the expectation now that they want to see the pictures right away. I think you can also just probably lie and say it's film and whatever. No one's gonna know. But yeah.
Wow. That's intense.
yeah. That was not a good time.
Just continue on with your sort of general approach and philosophies. Do you have any philosophies around post-production? Do you retouch heavily, or do you try to get it in camera?
I still believe like you get it in camera. I think it's really, really, really important to know the image that you want and that you're after and that you're taking when you take it. There's still happy accidents in X, Y, and Z, and there's also situations where you might look at something and say beforehand, like, I need to crop this because it's far away, or whatever the case is, and that's fine. But like, I really, really, really try to keep things as pure, like they used to say, like in the can as possible.
For sure.
I mean, and conversely, I think if you're not doing like Lightrooms and levels and curves, like that's just unprofessional.
Right.
I think people who are not photographers wrongly believe that that's something that only exists now with Photoshop, and like, no, point in fact, like every photographer used to have a whole group of guys behind him that were handling his film and editing his film and cleaning his film up and retouching his film. That's always occurred. It's easier now, and it's easier for the photographer now because he doesn't need to have 5 or 6 guys behind him. I see a lot of people, especially in street style, that do like really heavy retouching and photoshopping, which I don't agree with, because I think that's sort of against the genre. Like, it's meant to be real people with real style. You could also say that it's been heavily corrupted by influencers and
Right.
fashion advertising pivoting on that. But I don't do, in street style, I don't do any retouching or photoshopping. The rare occasion might be something like really egregious in the background that's like really, really awful, and that's kind of in the context of like I would never do that on another project except for street style because it's meant to be sort of idealized.
Sure.
I also think people have gone a little bit crazy with like the amount that they push their digital processing. I look at a lot of images and I'm just like, oh my god, this is so processed. Like,
Yeah. You can tell immediately. It has that look.
yeah, you can tell, and I think it detracts when everyone has a saturation and the vividness like just pegged. You're presenting people with a world that is no longer real, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge is now, how do you make an image? How do you make like a faithful image of the real world, not like an attractive image? I think like photography has really been stuck in this kind of cult of perfection and beauty for like a long time, and we're still chasing that. And like,
that's a really interesting
now
point.
we have kind of an inflation on reality.
Yeah.
You know, which I don't think is a good thing.
Right.
But I still would say like the correct way to do things is like, you know, react to something, know what you're after, get it in the can, and then your post processing is just sort of your values on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't think it needs to be
Tweaking a few things here.
I don't think it needs to be extreme. If you're ever in a non-commercial capacity, you know, if it's not a ad campaign or a lookbook or something like that, like if you're out shooting on the street, and like if you need to Photoshop something out, like you just didn't get the image.
Right.
And that's okay. Like you don't
Right.
always get the image. It's fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, I'm definitely more of that camp, for sure. I also believe in just getting it in camera exclusive. Maybe that just comes back from the fact that
It
I
just
learned on film.
never, I don't know, retouching and all that. Like I'm very savvy in that, but it never feels the same.
It doesn't. That's true.
Like the best images are just like, you got it.
Right.
You know, it's
Yeah.
right there. It's in your hand.
For sure. I know you mentioned the 85 mil lens. Is that
Yeah.
kind of your go-to focal length?
That is, and I think I started on a 50. I was just shooting 85 for a really long time, and then it was like 75 to 200. Been messing around a lot of like 135. It's a back and forth. I think I like the 50 because it's very close to human vision, and I quite like that. Like, you look at that and feel like you're in a scene, whereas I look at, probably because of a fashion background, I look at a 35 or like a 28, and it just feels fishbowled and insane to me. It's almost comical, and it's really interesting, and I enjoy it, but
Right.
it just doesn't, I'm like, it doesn't strike me as real. 85 is really nice, I think, because it allows you to be very selective with the real world around you. It's a good standoff distance. I find that like that 15-foot distance is like quite nice on an 85.
Mhm.
In terms of the things I've done involving like conflict or matadors and things like that, I've used an 85 a lot for that, and people are kind of like, oh, what are you doing? Like, this isn't a photojournalism lens. This is like a fashion lens, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, one part of me is like, that's what I know and that's what I'm used to. But the other part is it allows you're really allowed like a single subject with that. So the dialogue that you're picking is very narrow.
Yeah.
But also I think very deep. And I think when you work with the 85 or like longer telephoto lenses, like you get really used to the flatness of it.
Yeah.
And you get really used to how it renders like the human face. So almost anything I do, it's like a 50 and an 85 or a 50 and a 90.
Yeah.
Like both of those things, and it's always a debate to me like which one I use, but most of the time I just use both.
Yeah.
Kind of like situation choose, and that seems to work out.
Do you usually carry two bodies?
If I'm just on the street doing my thing, like normally I have one. If it's an assignment like the recent like Calcio Storico thing, I mean I had two lenses like the entire time. In those kind of situations, like when you're doing reportage, it's really hard to know what you're going to encounter, and it's almost impossible to know what the lighting is. Like for the Calcio Storico thing, which was in Florence, that was like shooting guys in like really, really seedy, fucked up gyms with like awful lighting.
Right.
Amazing images, super dramatic, lots of motion, but you have no idea what the lighting is going to be, and it was almost always at night. So with that, I was shooting like the 50 quite a lot.
Yeah.
Because you can get a little bit more wide open with that, and there's just like there's so many things going on around you. And then when we got to the actual fights, the actual matches, it was totally different. You were stuck in one fixed position the entire time. You couldn't move at all. A super harsh light, a lot of refracted light, really, really orange, red, yellow, kind of like hot light. And you couldn't move at all. And there was just violence fucking everywhere. So with that, I never touched the 50. I had a 90 on my back, which I like barely ever used, and most of that was a 75 to 200. Wow. 70 to 200.
Yeah.
Because it was just like things happening everywhere, and a lot of it I was shooting behind a barrier with mesh in front, I guess to protect the photographer. So it was like that was like a really, really different thing.
Right.
But I'd say if it's an assignment that I normally carry two, if I'm just walking around, then I only carry one.
Yeah.
I see a lot of guys walking around with like a backpack and a tripod and like 2 cameras, and it's like that just seems.
How can you react with that?
Yeah, how can you react? And I think you're just overthinking it.
Yeah.
But 2 cameras, especially with the MD system, works out. It works out pretty well because like they're very simplified and they're very pure, and you kind of it gives you the ability to rack to kind of like 2 different sets of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does the M6 ever make an appearance, or do you just lean on the MDs at this point?
I still shoot the M6, but I only shoot it inside of the state of California.
Yeah.
Mostly when I'm home. And I love film, and it's irreplaceable, but I went through so many, like, you know, turning in 110, 120 rolls of film and getting 30% of them back with, like, fog and dust from, like, sitting in a suitcase or getting x-rayed out with a bunch of waves through it. It's really problematic. It's not the challenge of using film, it's just the fact that the world used to be built with quite a lot of infrastructure to use film.
Right.
You're sending it out, you're getting processed. It was sent by special mail courier where, you know, they really respected it. You could buy good film almost anywhere, any major capital, you could get it processed. Like, if you're not in LA, New York, or Paris, I don't know where you get film processed. And carrying it around is a bad idea. But inside of California, I love using it. It's what I shoot around home. And then if it's appropriate for a client, it's always what I'll prefer to work on.
Yeah.
With that understanding. But I think there's a really nice parity between using that at home and using the MD when I'm traveling.
Yeah. Do you typically carry a camera with you, or do you take breaks from shooting?
I almost always have a camera.
Yeah.
I think photography is really easy, and with that you have the burden of always needing to have a camera.
Right.
It's your job.
Yeah. It was interesting in one of the previous podcasts with Matt Hranek, we were talking about this idea of traveling and maybe taking a moment or two to live in that moment versus photographing it, and we were talking about the existential crisis of the photographer, where it's like, well, that light's really pretty right now, maybe I should pick up that camera.
Right, and that's really, really hard. Like, I remember like years ago, there was years and years ago, this is like when I first got into photography, I saw these like amazing dudes all styled out in like a vintage Bronco, like rolling down the street, and I was in like somewhere down by San Diego, and like I was with a girl at lunch, and like I jumped on the table and like jumped over this little barricade on the restaurant, and like went tearing down the street to take a photo, and I came back and she was gone. And I was like, well,
did you get the shot?
I'm not really gonna complain about that. Like, at the time I was psyched. I think photography is if you're really gonna do photography is how you live, and photography is a lifetime obligation. You always have a camera with you.
Right.
A lot of my favorite photos are personal photos, and like those are never gonna be published, but that's because, and they have the most meaning to me, and that's because I have the camera with me when that shot occurs. I think if it is who you are and the entirety of who you are, it's not that you're at that lunch and you just bailed out and everyone's bummed. It's like, no, that's who you are.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's kind of, it becomes, if it becomes the way you experience the world, that's acceptable. If it is something that just interrupts your day, either you're not a photographer or you're meant to be like a studio photographer, which is totally fine. That's just like a different way of that's a different way of working. Another part of that, like the more disruptive example of that would be like social media and like self-documenting, where I don't find a camera to be disruptive at all, and like I always have one with me. I find cell phones incredibly disruptive and cell phone cameras incredibly disruptive, and the highlight of my day is if I'm in a place where I don't need my phone and I can just put my phone away for the day.
Right.
I would much prefer to go through the day, take photos on my camera and post that stuff later than like be pulling out my camera to document like my sandwich that I had or whatever the case is. And I see that disruption creeping into the lives of everyday people much more than photographers have ever had interference from their own cameras.
Right. I would agree with that.
I think it's your motive, and it's the kind of photographer you are.
Yeah. The next thing I'd just love to get into is your own personal tastes and aesthetic, and how you think about your own personal style and what influences you on that side of things.
Well, as far as my own taste or my own style, we're in a really privileged time where you get to see the backside of every creative person's life, which I don't think we got to see before, which is kind of interesting. I'd say it's very hard to separate my own taste and my own style from what influences my work or what things I pursue in my work. I mean, something grabs your attention, something most importantly grabs your imagination, and like I think for at least for me, I would assume for other creative people, that can become like an obsession, like a real force in your life, you know?
Yeah.
And also something not just a force in your life, but also something that has a very deep effect on you personally. I mean, I spend so much time looking at other people and what they're wearing and what that means to them personally, what that means culturally, what that means politically. What I wear myself it's very considered, but it's also very, in a lot of ways, very reserved, and it's definitely not, but I like to think it's very minimal, because I think if like you're living your whole life inside of that kind of bubble, your choices affect you deeply on like a personal level. Like
right.
I don't wear black, right? I have like one black motorcycle jacket, which I'm retiring after crashing in it.
Oh God.
And like I don't wear black because it has a really severe effect on me. It makes me very, very severe and very black and white and very serious about things, and like hence I don't wear black. But I'd say what I wear is very much about what I've learned to admire in other people. I find that if I have like a new friendship or a new relationship, or I've gone to a new place and I've found an incredible people that I admire. Really good example of that would be like the Kurds in Kurdistan. I'm automatically I automatically kind of mimic their dress. Part of that is a very, very human facet of dress, which is like we always try to blend in, right? We always try to imitate
right.
what we admire, but also some of it is also just like intentional, and like I really admire these people, therefore I'm going to carry a little bit of who they are with me by the way I dress. So a lot of it is like places I've been and things I've admired in the people that I've met, and also just like things you've learned. Like you wear something in a new way and it's more comfortable or warmer or works really well. It can also be specific people you've met. I ran into Matt Franek like 4 years ago. Didn't know who he was. I ran into him somewhere in Brooklyn, and I was just like, who is this guy? He's so cool, and there was something about him. I'm like, I'm gonna meet this guy again. Like, there's something going on here. This guy's it. And I think like I wear beat up white jeans like 90% of the time after getting to know Matt, and like he's kind of the guy who was like, oh, this is a thing that you could do, like white jeans work, whereas previously I was like, oh no, they'll get dirty, like that doesn't work. Like blue jeans every single day, you know?
Right.
So I think a lot of it is like imitative and emotional and based on things that like I like or absorb, and then the other aspect of it would be practicality.
Mm-hmm.
I guess like things that work. I mean, most of my life is out of a suitcase, and you have to learn how to make everything you can pack in a suitcase and not be in various airlines absurd weight restrictions. Not stay in their good graces, right? So
right.
like a lot of things I've wound up mixing together has just been out of necessity.
Right.
I mean, anywhere I go, I pack one suit, and then probably one jacket and one pair of pants from Acronym,
Yeah.
and like some white jeans, a bunch of bespoke blue button-down shirts, and like some of my own stuff, and just kind of that all winds up getting mixed together in the wash. But all that's pretty practical, right? Like one good blue or gray suit will take you through like essentially like any formal meeting you need.
Right.
You can put a jacket on, you know, at night if you want to look a little bit more formal, or for a meeting or something like that, or you can wear the trousers separately. I'm a huge fan of Acronym, and that stuff's fantastic because it's aside from how it looks, it's the only thing I've ever put on that makes you genuinely feel like you can navigate life a little bit more easily. Like it's waterproof, it's super functional, you've got pockets for everything, it's very, very fluid to use. It feels very much not like armor, but like body armor used to.
Right.
And like you put that on, you've got to go cover a protest or some conflict somewhere, or matadors or whatever, and you puts you in a sort of combative mindset, and it's, you know, you can functionally carry everything you need, and it's waterproof. But you can also mix that with a suit, you can mix that with casual clothes, and the rest of it is really just like what's versatile, what works really well. You know, like I think I have like 15 bespoke Oxford cloth button-down shirts.
Nice.
And like that sounds super banal and super boring, but you can wear those things with anything.
For sure.
And like you can put them in almost any washing machine and they're fine, and like they get wrinkles, they're fine. And then probably the last part of it is also like personal elected choice. Like what do you choose to put in that? Like it's never been a conscious or intentional choice of mine, but like there's a lot of military vintage in what I wear, and a lot of that is because I'm like, okay, like, you know, this thing is an M65 field jacket, it's a standard thing, and that will work almost anywhere on earth, and that works with a suit, and it works with casual clothes, and it works if it's cold, and it works if it's extremely cold. You can throw a liner on, and that makes sense for me because like I'm actually a veteran, so like me wearing this makes maybe like a little bit more sense than
Right.
I guess other people who are just kind of imitating a character or something.
It's not
they've seen on
military
television.
appropriation.
No, and I don't mind that, but I mean, at least for me, I'm like, okay, you know, there's a reason I wear this.
Yeah, for sure.
Some of my old military equipment as well, but like essentially you take, you know, things you react to emotionally that really resonate with you, practicality, and then your own idea of who you are, and you put that in like the washing machine,
Right.
the dryer on, like the tumble cycle, and like you get my wardrobe.
That's a good
Probably
synopsis.
like there's a lot of like tailoring and a little bit of editing in there. Like all my clothes I tweak a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like always feel like things need to be tailored or edited in like one way or another. That's a part of it too. But
You also have your own design company, would you call it? Observer Collection?
I guess a company of one. So I still have the Observer Collection, and a lot of that is like everything else I've done. It's from observation and also from a little bit from necessity. So
Right.
I spent a lot of time when I was still finishing up my degree in college, traveling and like working for GQ and other magazines, to the point where I was like barely ever at school, and I came to realize that I was traveling a lot and I was privy to experiencing culture kind of all over the world, but I was not the only one who was doing this. Most of my friends were doing this, whether they were photographers or designers or writers or press agents or businessmen. Like I realized that being on the cutting edge of things now meant being on an airplane quite often, and I also realized that living that kind of life fundamentally sort of changes your perspective, and with that also your needs change. So that was the kind of basis for Observer, was I was realizing that the creative class, the creative elite, if you will, were traveling all the time. And with that came this kind of like existential crisis, this sort of need for ritual.
Mm-hmm.
By that I just mean that acts that you can kind of repeat every single day wherever you are on earth, and that will give you a sense of routine in a life that is like anything but routine.
Right.
But as human beings, we need that to stay sane. People say we're nomadic, but we're also, when we were sort of designed as nomadic people. We were not designed to be nomadic people by jet plane, which we are now. So I observed that, and then also in my own life, there was just like, there's a lot of things I needed that didn't exist, or demands that I had on equipment that no one was really meeting. There was clothing for people who traveled a lot, which is like your REI and your Patagonia,
right?
Which was fine. But if you don't want to look like a backpacker and you want to go to a meeting and like actually get the job, high vis colors are probably not the way to do that.
Right.
You know, this was clothing. There's a whole spectrum of clothing that really functions in that like high speed consistent travel thing, but it doesn't necessarily work if you don't want to look like you're climbing the Himalayas,
right? Even
if in fact you are climbing the Himalayas. And then on the other side of thing, there was what fashion is and what high fashion is, and also what tailoring was, which was often beautifully made clothes of really fine materials, but maybe very, very stuck within one cultural vein, looking very British or very Italian or very American or very Japanese or very, very high fashion. Wasn't quite adaptable enough, it wasn't something you could wear when it was raining. It wasn't something you could wear if you decided that day that you were going to ride a motorcycle.
Right.
A lot of it was like a little bit too attention getting. I found that like with a lot of my work, you really don't want to be the fashion guy in the room. You know, you want to be well dressed enough that you meet someone and they trust you and they have a positive impression of who you are. But like, you don't mean that dude who's wearing like a full look of something, and you know you're in Sevilla, Spain, and everyone's looking at you like you've
right.
you know got an extra appendage growing out of your forehead. So all these things kind of made me think that there needs to be a uniform that's beyond a national identity, that's really built for people who travel well and often.
Yeah, no, it's a great line. I love the bag. I love the passport wallet and the sketchbook holder, which I definitely need to get at some point. Yeah, I'm excited to see what you do next with it.
Well, thanks, man. So am I. It comes out the production line.
And you also are pretty prolific with personal projects in between regular gigs, right? I mean, the Matador project, was that a personal project?
Yeah, that was, I mean, I think the thing with, we talk about, I think in the creative fields, like we talk a lot about like personal projects and passion projects and things like that, and I think it's kind of a misnomer. I think like if you're working creatively because that's where your strengths lie, then there shouldn't be any personal projects.
Right.
Let's not pretend that a lot of professional projects don't wind up being unpaid anyway. I think it's really important that you're constantly pursuing what your interest and passion is. A, because that's where you're going to do your best work, but also B, that's where you're going to continue to grow as a creative person.
Right.
You always need to be in that uncomfortable space between the unknown and the unfamiliar, and where control and comfort lie.
Right.
That's a critical space to consistently operate in. And that's where a lot of personal projects fall for me. Almost all the things that I've pursued just personally, that I've just said like, hey, I'm really interested in this. Matadors and Tauromaquia, which is like the world of the bulls, as the Spanish say. That's something I spent a lot of time on, and that did wind up turning into like I want to say it was like a 12-page editorial for L'Oficial.
Oh wow,
Spain.
Incredible.
So like, don't go into it saying, oh, like this isn't for any publication, there's no money in it. Like, go into it because you're interested in it, but constantly be thinking like, how do I tell this story to an audience, that isn't just like my Instagram or whatever.
Right.
Because I think if you're passionate about something, it's because you're finding truth in it, and that truth is something you need to share. So almost all of these projects, like the Matador project, started off as something where I read a couple books, was really interested, didn't know where my moral compass lay on it, went to go see several bullfights, went to essentially like a bullfighting library and just read every book I possibly could find, interviewed bullfighters, got to know quite a few of them, and that built up into a lot of personal work that eventually built into a professional project. But other ones, Caccia Storico in Florence, Nagaland, which is something that just came out with W.M. Brown magazine.
Yeah, that was a great story. I just read that one, actually.
Some of the stuff I've done on the Kurds and Peshmerga fighters and things like that, like those have all started I something I was interested in, but as I was interested in it and exploring it, I was also always trying to find a publication for it.
Right.
I think if you really believe in your subject or what you're learning or what you're interested in, like, you should always be finding a publication for it. Does a publication validate it? It doesn't validate the truth of the matter, but it does bring it to more people than were already looking at your work, right? It does bring truth to light, like, let's say.
That's a great point. I love that.
So I think that's always, it's important. It is important to do personal work. It's important to do work without the expectation of being paid for work that's just for your own professional growth, but that work should always be in pursuit of a truth that you want to put in front of people.
Right.
So I think that's really critical. All the personal projects I have all come from one line of questioning, and I would say originally that was just something that I kind of stumbled into, and then I became aware of it as I examined these projects. But about 4 years ago, at this thing called the Race of Gentlemen.
Oh, right, yeah.
Which is it's a bigger thing now. It's in Wildwood, New Jersey, and I think they've also done it in California. I went out there with a friend of mine who was really interested in it to shoot it for his brand. It was like a standard thing, you know. I mean, it was like vintage guys riding vintage motorcycles in the sand and like vintage hot rods. And I'd never photographed actual racing before, so I went to go set up on this sort of guard tower that they had. That was the turnaround point for the race. And there's a lot of other photographers down there. I had this big telephoto, and I was talking to my friend Christian McCain of Left Field. He asked me, he's like, where are you going to set up your camera? I'm like, I'm going to go up in that guard tower because it's got a good field of view and it's right at the end of the race. And I'm like, what about you? And he says, well, I'm going to wait before the start line. And I looked at him, like, why would you do that? There's no action there, you know? And he says, I just like watching their eyes before the race. He's like, you can always tell who's going to win. I thought it was really interesting. So I did one tour in the guard tower and immediately went back, and I spent the rest of the next 2 days of the races sitting before the start, just looking at these guys' eyes and looking at how they carried on before the race. Didn't pay attention to the standings, didn't pay attention to the events. I was just photographing guys based on my reaction to them, and I guess you could say the extremity of their persona, right?
Right.
Whether they were really bombastic or really quiet and introverted. In the end, I focused on 3 guys. One guy was very focused but very bombastic, and the world seemed to kind of circle around him. Another guy was kind of like a Shinto Buddhist monk and just like always had his eyes fixed on the finish line and looked very meditative on top of his motorcycle and was very, very, very severe. And then another guy was kind of constantly checking over his equipment, not really talking to anyone, going through things again and again and again. And respectively, they came in first, second, and dead last.
Who came in last?
The guy who was constantly going over his equipment, which maybe goes back to our
That's
photography
fascinating, isn't it?
equipment section. But I would say that the guy who came in dead last was actually a crowd favorite. It was his first race. He knew no one there. He built his own motorcycle. He had no mechanical background.
Wow.
He pushed his bike back every single time it broke down. So he was a crowd favorite. And I came to talk to these guys, and the guy who came in first, I kind of asked him, I was like, you're a really good rider. Why are you doing this versus MotoGP? Why are you doing this when there's no money in it? Why are you doing this when you're going to build a bike yourself? You don't have a team. And he says, I'm not racing the other guy. I'm just trying to beat myself. And with that, I kind of realized that, men are not competitive because they like winning, and they're not competitive because they like beating people. They're competitive because it's a form of self-confrontation. It's a form of meditation. This is like an epiphany to me, and that's what led me to want to go photograph conflict in Iraq, want to go photograph Peshmerga fighters, want to go photograph bullfighters, want to go photograph cultural historical fighters, because these were all men who had alternatives in life that weren't violent. They could have lived life other ways. They could have not been in the rules they chose, and yet they still chose in the 21st century to pursue a life that put them in mortal combat against other men, or at least, if not mortal combat, the severe risk of death or injury. And as that was a choice that they made, there had to be something that was more valuable than life and limb that they were making this choice based off of. And the conclusion I've come to is that men choose these competitive roles, and men are competitive in their nature because it is the most brutal and fundamental way to have a spiritual experience. So that's all of my personal projects. All of the projects that I've pursued on my own, let's say, have been in the vein of that line of questioning.
Wow, that's incredible.
Well, hopefully some truth comes out of it. Otherwise,
No,
I think
a
bunch of dumb boys.
No, I think there's so much there, and I think there's so much there to explore from the masculine side, from the feminine side, from all perspectives. I think I think that's a great place to end.
Well, women are smarter than us.
Right, they wouldn't.
They don't do that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great place to end. Is there anything else you feel like we should cover or that we didn't cover that you'd like to?
Oh man, I think that's like
more conversations after this, and I'm really excited to see what you do next with your personal work, with the photography editorial side, and then Observer collection as well. So I really appreciate you sitting down with me, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, man. Much appreciated.